When we talk about the U.S. debt problem today, most people think it's just another number that the government can manage through taxes or printing money. But the reality is far deeper and far more structural than most realize. What we're witnessing now is not a temporary imbalance that can be fixed with short-term policy. It's a long-term systemic issue that has been compounding for decades, silently shifting the foundation of the American and global economic order. The gap between what the United States spends and what it earns has become not just a fiscal issue, but a reflection of a broader structural decline, one that every major empire in history has faced in its late stage. To understand what's happening, we must first look at the mechanics of money and debt. Governments, like individuals, have income, expenses, assets, and liabilities. When expenses exceed income, they must borrow to make up the difference. For decades, the U.S. has spent far more than it has earned through taxation. Wars, social programs, stimulus spending, and now entitlement obligations have all outpaced government revenue. Initially, debt can be productive. It can stimulate growth, build infrastructure, or fund innovation that pays off later. But over time, when borrowing is used to finance consumption rather than productivity, the system starts to weaken. In the 1940s, after World War II, U.S. debt was extremely high, around 120% of GDP. But the country had two key advantages: strong post-war productivity growth and a dominant global position as the world's industrial and financial center. The dollar was backed by gold, trust in the U.S. financial system was absolute, and the U.S. had the world's largest manufacturing base. Over the following decades, productivity gains allowed America to reduce debt relative to GDP. However, since the 1980s, we've entered a different era, one driven by financialization, easy credit, and political incentives to spend without consequence. The core issue today is that the U.S. government has entered a stage where debt grows faster than income, meaning the compounding effect of interest makes the problem exponentially worse over time. Every dollar borrowed today requires more borrowing tomorrow just to service the previous debt. The Congressional Budget Office projects that, under current policies, the national debt could exceed 130% of GDP within the next decade, a level historically associated with declining empires and financial instability. What's even more concerning is that interest payments alone are now among the largest line items in the federal budget, surpassing spending on national defense or education. When you reach a point where you're borrowing money to pay the interest on previous borrowing, that's when the system enters a self-reinforcing debt spiral. In the past, such imbalances were corrected through austerity or inflation. Austerity, cutting spending or raising taxes, is politically unpopular. Inflation, on the other hand, erodes the real value of debt, but comes at the cost of weakening purchasing power and trust in the currency. Since 2008, and especially after the pandemic, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury have increasingly relied on the second path debt monetization. This means the central bank creates money to buy government bonds, effectively financing the deficit through money creation. In the short term, this approach prevents a fiscal crisis, but over time, it undermines the credibility of the currency. It's a hidden tax on savers and wage earners because the value of money erodes as the supply expands. This dynamic, too much debt leading to money printing leading to inflation, is not new. It has repeated itself throughout history. In the Roman Empire, when silver content was reduced in coins in Weimar Germany during the 1920s, in post-war Britain when the pound lost its global reserve status, and in the 1970s when the U.S. had to abandon the gold standard. Each time, the root cause was the same government spending beyond their means, financed by creating money rather than producing real wealth. The current stage of the U.S. debt cycle shows all the classic symptoms of a late-stage empire dynamic: rising debt, widening inequality, political polarization, and loss of global trust in the currency. The difference today is that this is happening on a scale never seen before. The United States issues debt in its own currency, which gives it flexibility that other nations don't have. However, this advantage only holds as long as the world believes in the stability and integrity of the U.S. dollar. Once that confidence begins to fade, the system becomes vulnerable. We're already seeing early signs of this shift. Central banks around the world are reducing their holdings of U.S. treasuries. Global trade settlements in non-dollar currencies are increasing, and alternative payment systems are being developed to bypass the dollar-dominated SCFT network. Each of these changes chips away at the structural foundation of the dollar's reserve currency status. Another key aspect of the U.S. debt issue is the psychological element, because the dollar has been dominant for so long. Most investors and citizens believe it will always remain that way. But history shows that no currency, no empire, no financial system lasts forever. The Dutch guilder, the British pound, they too were once global standards. They declined not because of sudden collapse, but because of gradual erosion in credibility, trust, and productivity. The U.S. is now walking that same path, and most people are unaware of it because they're accustomed to the privileges that come with reserve currency status. This brings us to a deeper truth about systems and cycles. What can't go on forever eventually stops. You can't grow debt faster than income indefinitely. You can't print wealth. At some point, reality catches up. The question is not if, but how the adjustment will occur: through inflation, currency devaluation, or restructuring of obligations. When debt burdens become too large to be serviced through normal means, societies face difficult choices. They can default explicitly, inflate the debt away, or undergo major policy and social transformations. Historically, the United States has chosen inflation and currency debasement over direct default. And that's likely the path we'll see again, especially given the political gridlock in Washington. But there's still a way forward. Not an easy one, but a necessary one. It starts with acknowledging the problem for what it is. The U.S. must confront the unsustainable trajectory of its fiscal and monetary policy. Productivity growth must once again outpace debt growth, which means investing in education, infrastructure, and innovation rather than unproductive consumption. It also means reforming entitlement programs, addressing tax inefficiencies, and managing geopolitical exposure responsibly. On the individual level, investors and citizens need to understand the implications of this debt cycle, how it affects inflation, interest rates, asset prices, and the value of the dollar. Those who understand these mechanics can position themselves to protect and grow their wealth even in times of systemic change. The key lesson here is that debt is not inherently bad. It's a tool. But like any tool, when misused, it becomes destructive. The problem isn't debt itself. It's when borrowing outpaces the ability to repay through real economic productivity. That's where the U.S. is now, at a point where new debt is not generating equivalent returns, where money is being created to sustain appearances rather than fundamentals. This imbalance cannot persist indefinitely. At some point, markets, investors, and foreign governments will demand accountability, and when that moment arrives, the shift will be swift. The challenge for all of us is to see it coming, not with panic, but with clarity, understanding, and preparation. To understand the debt situation in the United States, and by extension, the world, we need to step back and look at the concept of long-term debt cycles. Most people are familiar with short-term business cycles, periods of growth followed by recessions, usually lasting 5 to 10 years. These are caused by fluctuations in credit, spending, and central bank policy. But beneath those smaller cycles lies a much longer rhythm, the long-term debt cycle, which spans decades and determines the rise and fall of economic empires. The U.S. is not just in another business cycle downturn, it's entering the late stage of a long-term debt cycle that has been building for over 75 years, and history tells us what tends to happen next. Debt cycles begin innocently. Borrowing allows for spending beyond current income, which stimulates growth. This borrowed money can be used productively to invest in infrastructure, education, and an innovation that increase future income or unproductively for consumption and political promises. In the early stages, debt boosts productivity and living standards. Everyone feels wealthier. Businesses expand, asset prices rise, and optimism spreads. Politicians take credit for prosperity, but this prosperity is often built on borrowed time. Because as more debt is accumulated, the cost of servicing it rises, and future income must be used to pay past obligations. The short-term cycles that most people experience are like waves on the surface of a much deeper ocean. Central banks raise and lower interest rates to smooth out booms and busts, but the long-term debt cycle is driven by the accumulation of debt and the compounding of interest over decades. In the early and middle phases, credit expansion fuels growth and confidence. But as the cycle matures, debt levels become too large relative to income. The economy becomes dependent on low interest rates and easy money to sustain itself. That's when central banks find themselves trapped, unable to raise rates without causing a crisis, and unable to keep them low without creating inflation or asset bubbles. This is where the United States stands today. After decades of borrowing to finance wars, tax cuts, social programs, and crisis interventions, total debt, public and private, has reached unprecedented levels. When debt becomes this large, it changes the behavior of the economy itself. Productivity growth slows because new borrowing no longer generates equivalent output. Each dollar of debt adds less and less to GDP. In the 1950s, $1 of debt might have created $1 of growth. Today, it takes nearly $4 of debt to generate that same dollar of GDP. That's a sign of a late-stage cycle, where borrowing sustains appearances rather than creating real wealth. History gives us many examples of how these long-term debt cycles play out. In the early 20th century, the British Empire faced a similar trajectory. Heavy borrowing to fund wars and maintain global dominance led to rising debt and declining productivity. As the burden grew, the pound lost its status as the world's reserve currency, and the global system shifted toward the US dollar. Before that, the Dutch Empire went through a similar process in the 17th and 18th centuries. Innovation and trade fueled their rise, but over time, excessive debt, declining competitiveness, and costly wars led to their decline. In both cases, the late stage was marked by three key factors: unproductive debt, social and political divisions, and the gradual loss of global confidence. When the debt cycle reaches its later stages, societies often experience widening inequality. This is because monetary policy, such as low interest rates and quantitative easing, disproportionately benefits those who own financial assets. Asset prices rise, but wages stagnate. The wealth gap widens, leading to social frustration and political polarization. We see that pattern clearly in the United States today. The top 1% owns more than 30% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% holds less than 3%. This inequality is not just a moral issue, it's an economic and systemic risk. As tensions rise between the haves and have-nots, societies become more unstable. Historically, that instability has been a precursor to major shifts in governance, policy, and even the global order. When the imbalance becomes unsustainable, something has to give. Typically, there are four ways nations deal with excessive debt. They can grow out of it, cut spending, default, or print money. Growth is the most desirable, but it's difficult to achieve when debt levels are already suppressing productivity. Austerity, or cutting spending, is politically painful and often leads to social unrest. Default, outright refusal to pay debts, destroys trust and can collapse the financial system. That leaves the fourth option: printing money, or what economists call debt monetization. This is when central banks create money to buy government debt, keeping interest rates low and funding deficits indirectly. It's an invisible form of default, not through non-payment, but through devaluation. In the short term, monetization can seem harmless. It allows governments to keep functioning and markets to stay liquid. But in the long term, it leads to currency debasement and loss of confidence in the monetary system. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s, when the U.S. was forced to abandon the gold standard. The dollar's value collapsed, inflation surged, and interest rates soared. The Federal Reserve had to raise rates above 15% in the early 1980s to restore stability. That reset was painful, but necessary. The concern today is that the U.S. may face another version of that reckoning, but with far higher debt levels and far less political unity to handle it. The U.S. debt cycle has entered the stage where monetary policy alone cannot fix the problem. The Fed can manipulate liquidity, but it cannot create productivity. You can't print energy, innovation, or social cohesion. Those must come from real structural reform. Yet, as in many late-stage cycles, political incentives discourage difficult choices. It's far easier to borrow and promise short-term relief than to confront long-term reality. The result is a system that keeps expanding credit while weakening the foundation that supports it. Another warning sign of late-stage debt cycles is declining return on money and rising speculation. When people lose faith in stable returns from savings or bonds, they seek riskier assets, stocks, real estate, or cryptocurrencies. Prices rise not because of fundamental value, but because of excess liquidity and speculative momentum. This behavior reflects not confidence, but desperation for yield. It's another symptom of an aging debt cycle, an economy floating on debt-fueled optimism rather than productivity-driven strength. Eventually, every long-term debt cycle ends in one of two ways, either through managed deleveraging or through disorderly collapse. Managed deleveraging, which is rare, involves a coordinated effort to reduce debt burdens gradually through controlled inflation, spending cuts, and productivity reforms. Disorderly collapse, on the other hand, occurs when confidence breaks suddenly. Interest rates spike, asset values plunge, and governments scramble to restore stability. History shows that the latter is more common because human behavior, denial, greed, and political short-sightedness tends to delay the necessary adjustments until it's too late. Today, the warning signs are flashing across multiple dimensions: fiscal, monetary, geopolitical, and social. The U.S. is not collapsing, but it is approaching the limits of its debt-driven model. The long-term debt cycle is near its final phase when debt service costs, social divides, and global competition converge to force change. The key question is whether that change will be managed through wisdom or triggered by crisis. For individuals, the lesson is not to fear the cycle, but to understand it. Debt cycles are part of how economies evolve. They create opportunities for those who recognize patterns early, those who study history, who diversify their holdings, and who invest in real assets and productive ventures tend to emerge stronger from these transitions. For nations, the lesson is the same. Resilience comes not from denial, but from adaptation. The United States still has immense strengths. innovation, entrepreneurship, and global influence. But to sustain them, it must realign its economy from debt-driven growth to productivity-driven prosperity. The late stage of a debt cycle is not just an economic phase. It's a test of character, leadership, and understanding. Those who learn from history can navigate it. Those who ignore it will be overwhelmed by it. The key is to recognize that the laws of economics, like the laws of nature, eventually enforce balance. Debt cannot rise faster than productivity forever. The reckoning may come gradually or suddenly, but it always comes. To truly understand the risks facing the global economy today, we must look beyond numbers and focus on relationships. The relationships between nations, between currencies, and between trust and power. Money is not just a financial instrument, it is a contract of confidence, a reflection of belief in a system's stability. When that belief erodes, even the strongest empires can fall. That's the quiet but profound change we're witnessing now, the gradual erosion of trust in the U.S.-led financial system, and the beginning of a new era in global power dynamics. For nearly 8 decades, the United States has been the anchor of the global financial order. The dollar has been the reserve currency. U.S. debt has been the safest asset, and U.S. markets have been the most liquid and trusted in the world. That dominance was not accidental. It was earned through strength in production, innovation, and military power following World War II. When the Bretton Woods system was created in 1944, the U.S. held most of the world's gold reserves and industrial capacity. Other nations were willing to hold dollars because they were as good as gold, backed by a powerful and disciplined economic engine. But over time, as the U.S. accumulated more debt and printed more dollars, that foundation began to weaken. The breaking point came in 1971 when the U.S. closed the gold window, effectively saying to the world, you can no longer redeem dollars for gold. That decision marked a historical turning point. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency, but its value was no longer tied to a tangible asset. It was tied to faith. Faith in the U.S. government's ability to manage its finances responsibly. Faith in the Federal Reserve's ability to maintain stability. Faith in America's continued dominance in trade, innovation, and defense. For decades, that faith held strong, but faith is not infinite. It must be earned and renewed through credibility. In recent years, that credibility has begun to waver. The U.S. debt has surpassed levels once considered unthinkable. Fiscal discipline has eroded as political polarization makes long-term solutions impossible. Monetary policy has shifted from stability to stimulus, and every economic slowdown is met with more money printing. For investors and foreign governments, this creates a paradox. On one hand, the dollar remains the most widely used currency in U.S. Treasuries remain the deepest financial market. On the other hand, the underlying fundamentals, the debt, the deficits, the politics are deteriorating. This disconnect between perception and reality is not sustainable forever. We are now witnessing a gradual but measurable diversification away from the U.S. dollar. Central banks around the world, from China to Brazil to Saudi Arabia, are reducing their holdings of U.S. treasuries.